Hello, I'm Robert Bond. I'm a partner at Bristows, and I wanted to talk to you for the next few minutes about the EU General Data Protection Regulation, and specifically about the process that can be relied on for collecting personal data, known as legitimate interest. We all know that under the current EU data protection laws in each member state, there are a number of lawful mechanisms for processing personal data about individuals. Mostly we focus on consent, and indeed the General Data Protection Regulation focuses considerably on consent. But apart from consent, one of the other mechanisms that can be relied on is contractual necessity. In other words, if I'm purchasing something online, the retailer will need my name and address and my financial details in order to contract with me, and to a certain extent it's implicit that they will process my personal data, so consent in a way almost doesn't come into it. But then there may also be the needs of public authorities to carry out certain public tasks where the current law and GDPR specifically say that public tasks or the roles of public authorities means that data can be lawfully processed. Then there is legitimate interest, and that's where I want to spend the next few minutes. There are some other grounds for lawful processing, such as legal obligations, and indeed there may be other laws that mandate processing of personal data that in a sense override data protection laws, like say money laundering regulations or anti-money laundering regulations. But let's look at legitimate interest. When you look at the description in GDPR of legitimate interest and the other lawful reasons, legitimate interest is number 6 out of 6 mechanisms for processing personal data. But there's no hierarchy, so it doesn't mean that consent is number 1 and legitimate interest is number 6. They're all equally capable of being relied upon in the right circumstances. What's important with legitimate interest is that the current law and the law in GDPR, which comes into force on the 25th of May 2018, spell out that if a business or a data controller relies upon legitimate interest, then it must have regard to the rights of individuals and ensure that those rights of individuals don't override that legitimate interest. Specifically, Recital 47 of GDPR says the legitimate interests of a controller, including those of a controller to which the personal data may be disclosed or of a third party, may provide a legal basis for processing, provided that the interests or the fundamental rights and freedoms of the data subject are not overriding, taking into consideration the reasonable expectations of data subjects based on their relationship with the data controller. We can draw out from that there needs in a way to be a balancing test between what the controller feels is a legitimate interest on the one hand and what the rights of the data subject are on the other hand. We also can draw from Recital 47 that there must be a relationship between the controller and the data subject for legitimate interest to be relied upon at all. That may mean that there has been some previous engagement between the data subject and the controller, maybe through a purchase, maybe through the completion of an application form for insurance, for example, or opening a new bank account, and that as part of that continuing relationship, the business may feel that there are legitimate grounds for further engaging with the data subject directly or further processing the data subject's personal data. GDPR very helpfully calls out a number of examples where legitimate interest may apply. And for the marketing industry, it's most helpful to see that direct marketing may be a reason where legitimate interest can be relied upon. And again, I stress, providing that the balancing test has been carried out. But then so also is fraud prevention, anti-money laundering regulations, monitoring the age, for example, of the child if the data controller needs to ensure that they've obtained, for example, parental consent. There may also be legitimate interest where it would be within the reasonable expectation of the data subject that they might have some further engagement with or processing of, by the data controller, of their personal data. There may be some legitimate interests in organisational changes, for example, merger and acquisition, or investment or disposal, where it may be necessary, without the consent of the staff, to share staff data with the investor or with the company that may be making the acquisition, provided that a balancing test has been carried out to ensure that the rights of the individual are not denied or overridden. So when we talk about this balancing test, what I'd like to finish with is some guidance around the balancing test itself, or what I call a legitimate interests assessment approach. The LIA is a little like the privacy impact assessment, which is mandatory in many cases under GDPR. And it is in the form of an assessment documentation that helps the data controller ask itself pertinent questions about why it believes legitimate interest is the right choice for processing personal data as opposed to consent or contractual requirements and so on, and at the same time identifying what privacy impact that might have on the data subject, and at the end of the day coming to a conclusion that notwithstanding the rights of the individual, legitimate interest is still the right route to go. You might use an LIA where there is no other legal basis for processing available due to the nature or scope of the proposed processing, or where there are other legal bases but legitimate interest is the most appropriate. Now, at the moment, there is no guidance from the regulators about the balancing test or the legitimate interest assessment approach, but I'm pleased to say that I am myself in regular correspondence with both the Irish Data Protection Commissioner and the UK Information Commissioner about the advice that we have been giving in conjunction with the Data Protection Network on the use of LIA and the whole process of relying upon legitimate interest. We expect this to be a moving target, so to speak, and as soon as we have more information on legitimate interest and legitimate interest assessments, we'll do another short item for your enjoyment. So from me, thank you.